Okay, welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. We are coming up on the sixth Sunday after the Epiphany on the church calendar. And I'm going to depart from the lectionary this coming Sunday, which I do sometimes when there's a topic of interest to me that I think is relevant for the congregation. And the lectionary readings for that Sunday don't necessarily speak directly to that topic. So this coming Sunday, I'm doing a kind of part two of last week's sermon where I was talking about ChatGPT and the privilege that we have as human beings of being enfleshed, flesh and blood in tactile ways, making a difference in the world. So I'm going to do a part two this coming Sunday and talk about something that's related to that, which is also something that's quintessentially human, which is the experience of awe. And awe is a gateway to faith. Before we get there, though, we are going to start with the first of the three P's, prayer. And this is a prayer from the UCC Worship Ways. It's an Epiphany prayer. Holy One, you are deep within our world, calling us to join you in creating abundant life for all. Open our hearts to recognize you. Free us to trust your call and follow. Enable us to join in your work to make all things new. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. The second of the three P's is perspective. What perspective are we bringing to the text today? And the text will be Exodus chapter 3, by the way. So what is the perspective? So again, this is the sixth Sunday after the season, after the Epiphany in the season we call the season after Epiphany. And I'm planning again to preach a part two from last week's sermon about ChatGPT. And last week, as I mentioned a second ago, I preached on the privilege it is to be enfleshed and to be able to make a difference in the world as human beings in ways that can be touched and felt. It's kind of counterpoint to the limitations of artificial intelligence. This coming Sunday, I want to focus, as I mentioned, on awe, and specifically the relationship between awe and wonder. Those two are related. Awe is a gateway to faith. It stretches us beyond the confines of reason, opens us to something more, humbles us, because an experience of awe makes us feel our own limitations. And machines can't feel limitation and thus can't feel awe and thus can't reach out in faith beyond themselves. They can't overcome. And I wonder, just out of curiosity, whether the coming AI age will actually bring with it a resurgence in interest in religion, precisely because religious practice often involves experiencing awe and wonder. In his book, The Naked Now, Franciscan friar Richard Rohr illustrates awe by talking about three different ways of seeing a sunset. And he calls these three different ways three different eyes. He writes, three people stood by the ocean looking at the same sunset. One saw the immense physical beauty and enjoyed the event in itself. This one was the sensing type, who, like most people in the world, deals with what can be seen, touched, moved, and fixed. This was enough reality to consider, without much interest in larger ideas, intuitions, or the grand scheme of things. This is first eye seeing, which is good. The second person saw the sunset and enjoyed all the beauty that the first person did. Additionally, like all lovers of coherent thought, technology, and science, this person also enjoyed comprehension of the cyclical rotation of planets and stars, using imagination, intuition, and reason to see with a second eye was even better. The third one saw the sunset, knowing and enjoying all that the first and second people did. With the facility to progress from seeing to explaining to tasting, this person also stood in awe before an underlying mystery, coherence, and spaciousness that created a connection with everything else. Engaging this third eye is the best, for it is the full goal of all seeing and knowing. Richard Rohr offers this explanation of the story. Third eye seeing is the way the mystics see. They do not reject the first eye. The senses matter to them, but they know there is more. Nor do they reject the second eye, but they know not to confuse knowledge with depth or mere correct information with the transformation of consciousness itself. The mystical gaze builds upon the first two eyes and yet goes further. It happens whenever, by some wondrous coincidence, our heart space, our mind space, and our body awareness are all simultaneously open and non resistant. I like to call it, says Rohr, presence. It is experienced as a moment of deep inner connection, which can involve both profound joy and profound sadness. At that point, you either want to write poetry, pray, or be utterly silent. Now, he's using the word mystic there in a kind of generic sense. It's someone who feels deeply within their soul, so to speak, not necessarily the mystics of Christian history. Songwriter Nick Cave once said, "What a great song makes us feel is a sense of awe, because good songwriting comes from a place of deep feeling." Richard Rohr would say good songwriting comes from a kind of mystical sense. A few years ago, a fan named Peter asked Nick Cave a question: Can artificial intelligence ever write a good song? With all the news lately about the things ChatGPT is capable of, including writing songs, by the way, Nick Cave's reply to Peter is worth considering as it relates to the topic of awe. It's perfectly conceivable, he said, that AI could produce a song as good as Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit, for example, and that it ticked all the boxes required to make us feel what a song like that should make us feel. It's also feasible that AI could produce a song that makes us feel these same feelings, but more intensely than any human songwriter could do. But, he goes on, I don't feel that when we listen to Smells Like Teen Spirit, it's only the song that we are listening to. It feels to me that what we are actually listening to is the unique voice of the songwriter Kurt Cobain, a withdrawn and alienated young man, a young man who, by any measure, was a walking bundle of dysfunction and human limitation, a young man who had the temerity to howl his particular pain into a microphone, and in doing so, by way of the heavens, reached into the hearts of a generation. Nick Cave continues with these words: When we listen to great songs, we are listening to Beethoven compose the Ninth Symphony while almost totally deaf. We're listening to Prince, that cluster of purple atoms singing in the pouring rain at the Super Bowl and blowing everyone's minds. We're listening to Nina Simone stuff all her rage and disappointment into the most tender of love songs. We're listening to Paganini continue to play his Stradivarius as the strings snapped. We're listening to Jimi Hendrix kneel and set fire to his own instrument. What we're actually listening to, said Cave, is human limitation and the audacity to transcend it. Artificial intelligence, he said, for all its unlimited potential, simply doesn't have this capacity. How could it? So, to answer your question, Peter, AI would have the capacity to write a good song, but not a great one. It lacks the nerve. So, for today's perspective, on the one hand, we've got Richard Rohr talking about a third way of seeing that is deeper than what the senses can detect and deeper than what the mind can comprehend. It's an experience that touches something inside us so profoundly that it opens us to something more. And then on the other hand, we've got Nick Cave talking about human limitation and the audacity to transcend it in great songs and performances, which leave us gaping in awe. What AI, with all of its unlimited potential, can never replicate. And awe is a gateway to faith. That brings us to the third of the three P's, perspective. And today we're looking at Exodus chapter 3. And this is verses 1 through 15. This is the famous burning bush story. Moses was keeping the flock of his father in law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then God said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. God said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings. And I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? God said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. But Moses said to God, If I come to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. God said further, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my title for all generations. Okay, this is one of the most theologically rich stories in the Bible, and it includes a nice dose of awe and wonder. Now, a few interesting details before we get into that stuff. Notice that Moses' father-in-law is called Jethro in verse 1. In the previous paragraph, just prior to the one we began with, uh, Jethro was called Ruel, which suggests that the authors and editors of the book of Exodus were drawing from multiple sources to construct these stories. One source had one name for his father-in-law, and the other source had a different name. So think fireside tales told over generations and eventually written down and blended together into the masterpiece that we call the book of Exodus. A confusion of names such as Jethro and Ruel provides a clue that there's a literary seam in the story, and thus a possible pasting together of different sources by an editor or editors. Another curious detail is reference to Horeb, the mountain of God, in verse 1. Now, it's probably a synonym for Sinai, the mountain Moses ascended to receive the Ten Commandments from God a little later on in the book of Exodus. Different names for the same mountain is probably another indication of multiple sources being pasted together to tell this story. Scholar Robert Alter notes that the name Horeb means something like parched mountain, which means that there's an implicit irony in this story. Moses was born near the Nile River and was saved by the Nile when his mother placed him in a basket and sent him downstream to safety. So this same river Moses, whose name is a play on the word to draw out, as in to draw out of the water, this same Moses now encounters God on a parched mountain and in a bush of fire. Another curious detail in verse 2, it says, An angel of the Lord appeared to Moses out of the burning bush. The Hebrew word translated as angel can also mean messenger. What's interesting about this is that it's clear from the rest of the story that it's God who's speaking to Moses out of the bush, not a mere messenger of God. So again, Robert Alter, he says that it's possible that God sent a messenger to light the bush on fire, but it's also possible that some pious scribe over the years, when writing down this story, added reference to the messenger to avoid the insinuation that the God of the universe was revealed in a tiny bush. Can't know for sure, but there's interesting speculation going on in some of these details. Now, about the burning bush itself, the Hebrew word for bush is seneh. This could be a play on the word Sinai in the story, as in Mount Sinai, which is another name for Mount Horeb, which is where Moses is when he encounters God in the burning bush. So you can get a sense of how rich this story is. It's even richer when you probe its theology. So in verse 3, Moses sees the burning bush and then decides to get a closer look. In verse 4, when God sees that Moses is drawing closer, God calls out to him. There's a play here on the image of seeing. And the theological idea embedded in this interaction between God and Moses is that God responds to human beings. God is in a kind of responsive interaction with people. God is not a kind of master of puppets, to quote the metal band Metallica. Then comes the awe part of the story as we keep going verse by verse. And this awe part takes three forms. So, first, when Moses draws near to the bush, God calls out to him and says, I am the God of your ancestors. And then in verse 6, in response to God's declaration, Moses hid his face. The first interaction in almost every encounter in the Bible between a human being and God, or between a human being and a messenger of God, the first feeling that the human being has is fear. And oftentimes, either God or the messenger will reply, Fear not. The line between fear and awe is a thin line. Second example of awe. Beginning in verse 7, God speaks about having intimate knowledge of the Israelites' suffering as enslaved people in Egypt. God says, I have observed the misery of my people in verse 7. I have heard their cry. Again, this responsive idea. I know their suffering. Now, to know in Hebrew in the Old Testament is an intimate form of knowledge, sometimes used between partners as they interact with each other. It's to experience and to feel, I know their sufferings. And then God talks about coming down to deliver the people and bring them up out of the land. So it's down and up. So you have lots of stuff going on in this story. So theologically, God is revealed in the story as a God who feels and who experiences and who suffers with people. It's an awesome insight. So God is not distant from us, but is with us in a very intimate way, feeling with. So we see awe in the way Moses responds to God. Moses feels fear and hides his face. And then we see awe in the expression of God's closeness to human beings. God is not some king in the sky and distant. God is fully present and feeling with, which again is an awesome insight. And finally, there's awe in the name God reveals to Moses. So Moses asks God to give him a name. So, who should I tell the Israelites you are when I go to lead them out of Egypt? And God replies in verse 14, I am who I am. I love how God is a verb in this story. God is not a noun. God's name is a form of the verb to be. In verse 15, God self discloses further and says, I am the Lord, the God of your ancestors. So the word Lord, when you see capital Lord in the Old Testament, and especially in this story, it's the Hebrew name Yahweh. And it's pronounced, there's some debate about this, but it's pronounced in such a way that it sounds like breath, which I'll get into in just a second. So one way to interpret this name Yahweh is the one who brings things into being. So, being itself brings things into being. God is existence, is another way to say this. Back to the book, The Naked Now by Richard Rohr. Rohr says this about the divine name Yahweh. It was considered a literally unspeakable word for Jews. This unspeakability has long been recognized, but we now know it goes even deeper. Formerly, the word Yahweh was not spoken at all, but breathed. Many are convinced that its correct pronunciation is an attempt to replicate and imitate the very sound of inhalation and exhalation. The one thing we do every moment of our lives is, therefore, to speak the name of God. This makes it our first and our last word as we enter and leave the world. Rohr continues. I remind people that there is no Islamic, Christian, or Jewish way of breathing. There is no American, African, or Asian way of breathing. There is no rich or poor way of breathing. When considered in this way, God is suddenly as available or accessible as the very thing we all do constantly: breathe. Just keep breathing consciously, and you will know that you are connected to humanity, from cavemen to cosmonauts, to the entire animal world, and even to the trees and the plants. And we are now told that the atoms we breathe are physically the same as the stardust from the original Big Bang. Oneness is no longer merely a vague mystical notion, but a scientific fact. Now, I personally come away from such a revelation feeling awe. Our very breathing names God. From our first to our last breath, the name of God is on our lips. Awe pulls us out of the mundane repetition of our daily lives, and it lifts us toward the divine. And when we open ourselves in this way, the very next step is faith, a reaching beyond ourselves, a transcending human limitation, in the words of Nick Cave, a trusting that the one who is moving through our lives is nudging us toward where we need to go and is loving us every step of the way.